Sometimes the greatest answers to life's most complicated problems are hidden in the smallest, most ordinary things. What if I told you that something as simple as salt holds a mystery of influence, authority, and restoration? Think about it. Salt is common, yet it carries uncommon power. The question is, do we truly understand the spiritual significance hidden behind it? Tonight, we are not just talking about salt on food, but salt as a key to unlocking debts, restoring broken relationships, and shifting the hearts of those who once opposed you. Are you ready to uncover what has been hidden in plain sight? Sometimes we overlook the extraordinary because it comes wrapped in what looks ordinary. We are trained by life to search for the big, the loud, the dramatic, the spectacular. But what if the answer was never hidden in the grand? What if the solution to your problems, the release of your debts, the restoration of your relationships was tucked away in something small, something simple, something so common that you have walked past it 1,000 times without even recognizing its value? Salt. Just think about it. Salt is on almost every table, in every kitchen, on every shelf, and yet it carries a power far beyond seasoning food. When God wants to reveal something deep, He often hides it in what seems small, because the small doesn't threaten you. The small doesn't intimidate you. The small looks like it could never change anything. But haven't you learned by now, it's the things that look insignificant that often carry the greatest authority? Look at your life. The biggest shifts didn't always come from the big things. It wasn't always the promotion, the house, the car, or the crowd. Sometimes it was a word, a simple conversation, a moment of obedience, a tiny act of faith that shifted the entire direction of your life. So why would God not use something as small as salt to reveal a mystery? Salt has always represented preservation, purity, and covenant. Salt keeps what would otherwise decay. Salt preserves what would otherwise rot. Salt adds value where there was none. Isn't it interesting that when life feels bitter, when relationships grow cold, when money dries up, you are often searching for something big to fix it? But God is saying, look at the little. Look at what I've already placed in your hands. Could it be that the solution is not in chasing something greater, but in recognizing the power of what seems small? The truth is, debt does not always break by money alone, and enemies do not always shift by arguments or fights. Sometimes it's a hidden principle, a divine key, wrapped in something as simple as salt. When salt enters, bitterness leaves. When salt touches, preservation begins. When salt shows up, flavor is restored. And isn't that what you need? Isn't that what your situation demands? To be preserved, to be restored, to taste different than it does right now. So the next time you see something small, something ordinary, something you would normally dismiss, ask yourself, what mystery is hidden here? What authority is wrapped inside the little? Because what looks small to you may be the very thing that heaven has chosen to shame the mighty. And if salt, something so common, carries the power to shift atmospheres and break barriers, then what happens when we uncover the greater mystery of its influence? What happens when we learn how this simple element can silence enemies, release debts, and turn hearts back toward us? That is where we must go next. Salt is more than just a substance we sprinkle on food. It is a symbol, a code, a divine reminder of preservation and authority. From the beginning of time, salt has carried significance. Ancient civilizations traded it like gold, kings stored it as treasure, and nations went to war because of it. Why? Because salt was never just about flavor, it was about influence. Salt had the ability to keep things from rotting, to protect what would otherwise decay, and to preserve value in a world where everything was breaking down. Do you see the mystery now? When you hold salt in your hands, you're holding more than crystals. You're holding a principle of dominion. Salt says, I will not allow what is valuable to spoil. Salt says, decay must stop here. Salt says, I will preserve what is mine no matter how much time passes, no matter what forces come against it. And isn't that what many of us need in our lives? Preservation in our finances, preservation in our marriages, preservation in our peace of mind. What if salt is more than physical, it's spiritual? Salt was also a sign of covenant. In ancient cultures, agreements were sealed with salt because it represented something that could not be corrupted, something enduring, something unbreakable. That's why Scripture calls us the salt of the earth. Not because we're meant to season meals, but because we are called to preserve truth, to preserve integrity, to preserve the standard of heaven in a world that is decaying every day. Do you feel the weight of that? Salt isn't just about taste. It's about trust. It's about carrying authority to preserve what others lose. And here is the part that stirs me deeply. Salt doesn't have to shout to work. It doesn't need to be seen to be effective. You may not even notice it at first, but the moment it's removed, you know something is missing. That's power, quiet influence, silent authority. Salt proves that true power doesn't always need to be loud, but it always leaves evidence. Could it be that your life is supposed to carry that same quiet, undeniable influence? Could it be that when you show up, bitterness is supposed to leave, corruption is supposed to stop, and decay is supposed to end? Think of this: when salt enters a meal, the entire dish is affected, not just a part of it. That means when you step into a room, when you carry this principle, when you activate this influence, the whole atmosphere must change. The enemy knows it, debt knows it, broken relationships know it. Because where salt is, corruption cannot remain. Where salt is, preservation must begin. Where salt is, covenant is unshakable. But here's the real question: if salt is this powerful, if salt holds such authority to preserve, purify, and protect, then why is it that so many people are still losing ground, still decaying, still being overtaken by what they should be stopping? The answer is not in the salt itself, but in how it is used. And that leads us directly to the next mystery. Influence is one of the most powerful forces on earth, yet it is often invisible. You can't always see it. You can't always measure it, but you can feel it. Salt is a picture of influence. It doesn't dominate the meal. It doesn't take over the plate. It doesn't shout its presence, and yet the moment it touches the food, everything changes. Influence is never about size. It is about effect. You don't need a mountain of salt, just a pinch, and the entire dish is transformed. Isn't it the same with your life? You may think you are too small, too insignificant, too overlooked. But the truth is, the right influence at the right time can shift everything around you. Salt influences without permission. It doesn't ask the meat if it can preserve it. It doesn't request approval from the soup before it adds flavor. It simply enters, and when it does, its influence cannot be denied. That is how real power works. Real authority does not beg for recognition. Real influence does not announce itself. It simply shows up, and when it does, everything else must adjust. Could it be that this is the same authority you are meant to carry? That when you step into environments, things that are broken should begin to mend. Things that are bitter should become sweet. Things that were decaying should be preserved. Salt also teaches us that influence goes beyond the surface. Sprinkle it on top, and it still finds its way deep inside. Influence penetrates. Influence seeps. Influence goes where eyes cannot see. That's why true influence is never about appearance. It is about impact. Some of the most powerful people you will ever meet are not on stages, not on screens, not in the spotlight, but their influence is undeniable. They shift atmospheres quietly, yet powerfully, just like salt. And here's the secret: salt never loses its identity. No matter where you place it, salt remains salt. Put it in soup, in meat, in bread, in water, it doesn't lose its nature. It simply transforms its environment. That's how influence should work in your life. You don't become what the environment is. You bring the environment into alignment with who you are. Isn't that the kind of influence the world needs? Not people who are shaped by circumstances, but people who shape circumstances with who they are. But there is a warning too. Salt that loses its saltiness is useless. Influence that is not exercised becomes irrelevant. Authority that is not activated becomes powerless. You were never designed to blend in. You were called to stand out, to preserve, to flavor, to shift, to influence. And if salt has this much impact in the natural, imagine what influence looks like when it is multiplied in the spiritual. So here is the question: if salt carries this much silent influence, if it transforms without asking permission, if it preserves without losing its identity, then how is it that God chooses the weak and the small to confound the mighty? What happens when he takes the ordinary and makes it extraordinary? That is the mystery we must now unlock. When you look at the way God operates, it almost never follows human logic. We live in a world that celebrates the big, the strong, the loud, the impressive, but God seems to delight in using the small, the overlooked, the underestimated. Isn't that fascinating? He chooses the simple to confound the wise. He takes what the world calls ordinary and uses it to unlock extraordinary results. And salt is one of those examples. It is small, it is simple, it is common, and yet it carries mysteries that kings and rulers could never fully understand. Think about it. Why would God use something as tiny as a seed to describe faith? Why would he use something as fragile as a child to describe greatness in the kingdom? Why would he take something as small as salt and give it eternal significance? Because it's never about the size, it's always about the principle. It's never about the form, it's about the function. That's why we can't afford to despise the little things. That's why we can't afford to ignore the things that seem too simple to carry power. What looks small today might be the very thing heaven is waiting to use to shift your tomorrow. Salt proves this principle. A little in the right place changes everything. Just a sprinkle transforms the flavor of the meal. Just a pinch preserves what would otherwise rot. That is the wisdom of God, to hide influence in simplicity, to package power in smallness. Because when the great see it, they dismiss it. When the arrogant encounter it, they ignore it. And by the time they realize its true worth, it's too late. The miracle has already been released. Isn't that exactly how God works in your life? While others are looking for thunder and lightning, he gives you something as quiet as salt and says, use this and you will win. This is why you can't underestimate yourself. This is why you can't underestimate the little acts of faith, the small steps of obedience, the simple habits of consistency. The world may say they don't matter, but God says, this is where I hide my power. And when you embrace the small, you step into the place where God confounds the mighty. That's why enemies are confused. That's why debt has to release. That's why hearts begin to soften. Because what they thought was nothing becomes the very thing that shifts everything. So the next time you feel small, the next time life tells you that you don't have enough, the next time people dismiss you as ordinary, remember this: salt is small, yet it carries authority. Salt is common, yet it carries mystery. Salt is simple, yet it confounds the mighty. And if God can hide power in salt, imagine what he has hidden in you. But if God chooses the small to shame the great, the next question is, how does this principle turn enemies into allies? How does what is simple break hostility and force reconciliation? That is where we must go next. Enemies are not always people with weapons in their hands. Sometimes enemies are people with bitterness in their hearts. Sometimes it is not a sword they carry, but a grudge, not a spear, but unforgiveness. And what salt teaches us is that even enemies can be turned into allies. Even hearts that are hard can be softened. Even mouths that once cursed, you can suddenly speak blessing. Isn't that powerful? That something as simple as salt, a symbol of covenant and preservation, carries within it the ability to shift relationships from hostility to reconciliation. Salt does not fight the food it enters, it transforms it. Salt doesn't argue with the bitterness, it dissolves into it and changes it from the inside out. That is influence, that is wisdom, and that is exactly how enemies are turned into friends. Not always by debating, not always by confrontation, but by bringing a presence that changes the very flavor of the atmosphere. Could it be that your greatest weapon against those who oppose you is not louder words or harder fists, but quiet influence? Could it be that your victory comes not by force, but by shifting the taste of the situation until even your enemies cannot resist? Have you noticed that when salt touches bitterness, it doesn't erase it instantly, but it balances it? It works gradually, but steadily until the taste is transformed. That's the power of influence. That's the wisdom of patience. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most, the people who owe you the most, the people who resist you the hardest are not waiting for your argument. They are waiting for your presence to shift their heart. And when that shift happens, they don't just tolerate you. They seek your forgiveness. They acknowledge their wrong. They beg for reconciliation. This is why salt is such a mystery, because enemies don't always fall through defeat. Sometimes they bow through transformation. Salt shows us that hostility can be preserved and redirected, that anger can be neutralized, that bitterness can be turned into sweetness. And when this happens, what was once an enemy becomes a bridge. What was once opposition becomes opportunity. What was once resistance becomes restoration. Isn't it amazing that God can take the very people who rose against you and turn them into the very people who promote you? So the next time you face enemies, the next time you encounter resistance, don't ask only for the strength to fight, ask for the wisdom to influence. Don't only pray for power to conquer, pray for the grace to transform. Because when salt is present, enemies cannot remain the same. They will either flee, or they will bow, or they will beg to be made right with you. But if salt can shift enemies into allies, if it can soften hearts that once hated you, then what does it mean for the hidden chains of debt in your life? What happens when this same principle begins to break financial bondage? That is where we must journey next. Debt is not just a financial issue. It is a spiritual bondage. It ties your hands. It limits your freedom. It silences your dreams. Debt has a way of making you feel like you are always behind, like you are always a step too late, like you are running but never arriving. And here is the truth. Debt is not only about money, it is about control. Whoever you owe controls a piece of your future. Whoever holds your debt holds a chain to your destiny. Isn't it time to break free? Isn't it time to see those chains fall? Now here is the mystery. Salt has always been connected to covenant preservation and release. In ancient cultures, agreements sealed with salt were binding, but they were also purifying. Salt was a sign of permanence, but also of cleansing. So when salt enters your situation, it does not just preserve, it purifies, it breaks what is false, it exposes what is temporary, and it secures what is eternal. That is why debts, both financial and spiritual, cannot stand when true covenant steps in. Salt carries the power to dissolve what tries to bind you. Debt thrives in corruption, in disorder, in decay. But salt is the very opposite. It stops decay, it brings order, it restores balance. Think about it. When you add salt to what is rotting, it slows down the corruption. And in the same way, when you activate this principle in your life, debts that were consuming you must stop. The decay of your finances must pause. The cycle of lack must break. Could it be that the solution to debt is not just more money, but a higher principle, a spiritual law that shifts the atmosphere around your resources? When salt touches food, it adds value. What was bland becomes desirable. What was worthless becomes valuable. And that is exactly what happens when this mystery touches your life. Your little becomes much. Your not enough becomes more than enough. Your empty becomes overflow. Salt adds worth to what seemed worthless, and suddenly, those who thought you could never repay are astonished to see you walk in freedom. Debtors who once held you down must let go, and you begin to see the hand of God turning your lack into abundance. But here's the key. Debt doesn't only bow to money, it bows to authority, and salt represents authority. Salt says, you will not spoil, you will not corrupt, you will not consume. And when that authority enters your finances, debt cannot stay, it must release, it must cancel, it must bow. Because preservation always overrules destruction, and covenant always overrules corruption. So the question is this: if salt can break the bondage of debt, if it can silence creditors and release your resources, then what about forgiveness? What about the deep places in your heart that still carry weight heavier than money, the offenses that no currency can pay for? That is the power we must uncover next. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things for the human heart to release. Yet it is also one of the greatest forces of freedom you will ever experience. People can carry offenses like chains, carrying anger for years, holding grudges like trophies, building walls so high that no one can get close. But forgiveness, real forgiveness, has the power to dissolve those chains, to break those walls, to turn enemies into brothers and strangers into allies. Isn't it amazing that salt, something so small and so simple, symbolizes this silent weapon of forgiveness and release? Salt enters bitterness, and instead of fighting it, it balances it. That is forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it balances the weight of it. Forgiveness doesn't deny the pain, it neutralizes its power over you. Just like salt preserves what is valuable, forgiveness preserves your destiny from being spoiled by anger. Because anger eats away at you like decay. Bitterness rots your peace like spoiled meat, but forgiveness steps in like salt and says, decay stops here. Corruption ends here. Bitterness has no more room here. And here is the mystery: when you forgive, it is not the offender who is set free first, it is you. When you release the weight, you are the one who walks lighter. You are the one who breathes again. You are the one who sees clearly again. Forgiveness shifts the taste of your own life before it ever changes anyone else's. Isn't it powerful that something so hidden, so quiet, can break years of heaviness in just a moment of release? But forgiveness also carries influence. When you forgive, even those who wronged you feel the shift. The enemy who once resisted you begins to soften. The debtor who once avoided you begins to return. Because forgiveness does what arguments never can. It shifts the heart. Salt shows us that you don't need to fight bitterness with bitterness. You don't need to fight hate with hate. You don't need to fight wrong with revenge. Forgiveness is the higher law. Forgiveness is the stronger force. And sometimes your greatest victory over your enemies is not in defeating them, but in releasing them. When you forgive, you strip the enemy of power. When you forgive, you stop being tied to the past. When you forgive, you preserve your destiny from the poison of offense. Forgiveness is salt. It cleanses. It preserves. It restores. And when forgiveness is present, even enemies must bow, even debtors must pay, even hearts must turn. But here's the question. If forgiveness is this powerful, if it shifts hearts, restores peace, and silences the enemy, then what about the greater picture? What about restoring value to a world that has lost its taste, to lives that have lost direction, to souls that feel worthless? That is the revelation waiting just ahead. We live in a world that is losing its taste, losing its values, losing its sense of what truly matters. People chase pleasure but end up empty. They gain possessions but lose peace. They collect knowledge but lack wisdom. Isn't it strange that the more advanced the world becomes, the more broken it seems? Families are crumbling, integrity is rare, loyalty is fading, and the question must be asked: what happened to the flavor of life? What happened to the taste of truth? What happened to the value of what is pure and eternal? Salt gives us the answer. Salt is what restores taste. Salt is what gives value to what was bland, what brings meaning to what was meaningless, what preserves what was ready to decay. Without salt, food loses its flavor, and without the principles of God, life loses its meaning. Salt represents your role in a world that has lost its way. You are called to restore flavor, to bring back value, to preserve truth in the midst of decay. Isn't it amazing that something so small, so unnoticed, carries such a massive responsibility? When the world loses its taste, it looks for substitutes. People try to season life with money, with fame, with influence, with entertainment. But no matter how much of it they add, the soul still remains bland. Why? Because substitutes can never replace salt. Substitutes can never preserve. Substitutes can never restore true value. That is why your presence matters, your influence matters, your role matters. You are salt. And when you step into an environment, you restore what was lost, you awaken what was dead, you bring back flavor to lives that had forgotten their worth. Salt doesn't have to be poured in heaps to be effective. Just a sprinkle shifts everything. That means you don't have to be famous, you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be recognized to carry impact. All you need to do is show up as salt, and the atmosphere around you begins to change. People who were bitter start to soften. People who were lost begin to see. People who felt worthless start to recognize their value again. Salt restores flavor, and when flavor is restored, life regains meaning. But here's the warning: salt that loses its saltiness is useless. When salt no longer adds flavor, it is thrown out. And in the same way, when we lose our influence, when we blend so much with the world that no difference can be felt, we lose our purpose. We are not called to be tasteless. We are called to stand out, to flavor, to restore, to preserve. And when we live this way, the world cannot remain the same. But if salt can restore value in a tasteless world, if it can give meaning where there was emptiness, then what about obedience? What about those moments when the simple act of following a divine instruction unlocks miracles that no effort of your own could ever achieve? That is the mystery we must uncover next. Obedience has always been the doorway to miracles. Not talent, not strength, not even intelligence, but obedience. When you look throughout history, the greatest breakthroughs did not come when people tried harder. They came when people obeyed. Think about it. The walls of Jericho did not fall because of weapons. They fell because of obedience. The Red Sea did not part because of human wisdom. It parted because of obedience. Water did not turn into wine because of expertise. It changed because servants followed a simple instruction. Isn't it amazing how something so small, so simple, can unlock results that no effort of man could ever achieve? Salt represents this same principle. You can have all the salt in the world sitting in a jar, but until it is released, until it is applied, it changes nothing. Salt only works when it is used. And obedience is the same. You can know truth, you can study wisdom, you can memorize every principle, but until you obey, nothing changes. Obedience activates potential. Obedience turns knowledge into manifestation. Obedience releases the hidden power of what already exists. Could it be that the miracle you have been waiting for is not delayed by heaven, but by your own hesitation to obey? Obedience doesn't always make sense. Marching around walls doesn't sound like a battle plan. Dipping in a river doesn't sound like healing. Sprinkling salt doesn't sound like breakthrough. But obedience is not about logic. It is about trust. It is about believing that God knows what you cannot see, that He has factored in details you cannot understand. And when you obey, even when it feels foolish, you position yourself for results that human reasoning could never produce. Here's the key. Obedience may look small, but it always carries big impact. Just as a sprinkle of salt transforms the entire meal, a single act of obedience transforms the entire situation. You may not realize it in the moment, but obedience is setting things in motion, shifting atmospheres, opening doors, and unlocking blessings you could never have earned on your own. That is why obedience is so powerful. It doesn't just change your action, it changes your outcome. But notice this, obedience is also preservation. When salt touches food, it keeps it from spoiling. When obedience touches your life, it keeps you from corruption, from destruction, from decay. Obedience preserves your destiny. It guards your steps. It keeps you aligned with divine timing. And when you live a life of obedience, you cannot remain the same. You are transformed. Your environment is transformed, and even those around you are impacted. So the next time you are tempted to hesitate, the next time you wrestle with doubt, remember this. Obedience may look small, but it carries the authority of heaven. And when heaven backs your obedience, miracles become inevitable. But if obedience can unlock unexplainable miracles, if it can shift what looks impossible into possible, then what happens when we discover the little that changes everything? That is the final key we must uncover. It is often the little things that carry the greatest power. The world trains us to look for the big, the dramatic, the impressive, but the wisdom of God is hidden in the small. A seed may look tiny, but inside it is a forest. A word may sound simple, but within it is destiny. Salt may look ordinary, but in it is the power to preserve, to influence, to transform, to restore. Isn't it interesting that what people dismiss as insignificant often carries the weight of heaven? Salt teaches us that the little can change everything. You don't need a mountain of it. You don't need barrels of it. Just a sprinkle shifts the taste. Just a pinch transforms the dish. That's how your life works too. Sometimes it is not about doing something massive, but about obeying in something small. One act of kindness, one word of forgiveness, one step of faith, one moment of trust. It can shift the whole direction of your life. Could it be that what you've been waiting for is hidden in one small decision? Could it be that your breakthrough is not far away, but right in front of you, disguised as something ordinary? The little that changes everything is not about size, it's about power. Salt reminds us that when the small carries divine purpose, it cannot be ignored. That is why God takes the little you have and multiplies it. That is why he uses the overlooked, the underestimated, the simple to confound the mighty. Because the moment you release the little, he breathes on it and it becomes more than enough. Think of it, 5 loaves and 2 fish feeding thousands, a shepherd boy's sling bringing down a giant, a handful of salt shifting the taste of a meal. Over and over again, we see the same principle. Never despise the little, never ignore the small, never underestimate the ordinary, for it is in the little that God hides the key to everything. And here's the truth. Your enemies will never understand it. Your debtors will never expect it. But when you embrace the little, when you honor the simple, when you obey the small, doors swing open, chains fall off, debts are released, and even those who once opposed you begin to bow. Because the little that carries divine power always changes everything. So as we close, let this echo in your spirit. Do not despise the small. Do not ignore the simple. Do not overlook the ordinary. For within it may be your breakthrough, your release, your restoration. Salt reminds us that the smallest things carry eternal weight. And now I leave you with this. When the little becomes everything, when the ordinary reveals the extraordinary, when the small carries the power of heaven, then nothing can remain the same. Lives are restored, debts are canceled, enemies are silenced, and destiny is preserved. The question is, will you honor the little so that you can unlock the everything?